So this is very much a work in progress. It's a book chapter that I've been, oh, sorry, I'll put my timer on as well. Working in the margins of the margins this session in what little time has been available. And it's for a book called Avian Aesthetics, Birds and Humans in the Literary and Popular Imagination. And Joshua is also preparing a chapter for this collection. I actually found it quite difficult to translate back from a chapter into a presentation and to try and fit everything into 15 minutes. So I'm not going to try and do that. I'm just going to speak to some parts of it. And hopefully, if it's of interest to you, you can take a look at that link in the chat to the full chapter, and feel free to make comments there. So the aim of the chapter is to focus on how game mechanics operate representationally. It introduces the concept that I've kind of summarized out of a different, synthesized out of a range of different arguments in game studies. And the book chapter tries to introduce an audience that is not familiar with game studies and these types of arguments. And this is the idea of ludo-thematic resonance, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. The analysis of the game is focusing on the relationship between the ludic, or the rules, the game mechanics, and the thematics. And I'm employing Nathan Altis's model for examining card games. That's built on a model for examining games hardware and the restrictions that games hardware have on the creative output of game designers, except in this instance, I'm calling it a cardware platform. And out of this argument, I kind of realized that what's happening with this game is the generation of a type of space that Michel Foucault calls a heterotopia. A heterotopia is and you're probably familiar with this, is a space that is intense, contradictory, transforming. He uses the metaphor of the mirror as a heterotopic space, which is that kind of uncanny feeling of realizing that you are simultaneously on both sides of the mirror, looking out at yourself and looking in at yourself. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about that as we go through. So Wingspan is a niche board game. It's not like a mass market game. It's not available yet in kind of department stores or stores like Kmart. It's much more of a specialist hobby game that you find in special game stores and online. Of course, you can buy it on Amazon. The designer, Elizabeth Hargraves, has won multiple awards for this since it was first published in 2019, including the very prestigious, for board games, the annual Germany, I never pronounce this correctly, Spiel des Jahres industry awards in Germany. The game has a couple of expansions that add more birds. There's now around 250 birds in the entire collection. And I'll talk about the illustrators of those birds in a minute. And they've also got their own book coming out. I've pre-ordered it. It should be in July. And there's also an amazing aftermarket. So this board game has such a huge following that there's an enormous aftermarket of paratext that you can purchase to expand your experience with the game. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Okay, so I want to start with some of the birds of Wingspan and talk about the relationship between the way they're represented and what they're doing in the game before getting into the game itself. The Oceania expansion is where all these birds come from. And starting with the Australian ibis, the infamous bin chicken, which gives players the ability to select cards from the discard pile, and I'll talk more about that. The New Zealand pukeko, requires the player to compare, sorry, wrong one. The Pukeko is communally minded. I like the Pukeko a lot. You can lay eggs on adjacent birds. The butcher bird, the grey butcher bird, who we get on my balcony here regularly, is quite fearsome, and when activated, you compare the wingspan, which you can see on the card just above the brown line there, against others, and if it's a smaller bird, it's tucked in behind this bird and it's converted into extra points and food resources. The Kakapo gives you bonus cards. It's obviously a critically endangered species, and so it's quite rare. And so if you're lucky enough to find this in your play, it gives you major bonus points. The Australia's superb lyrebird shows off its remarkable mimicry ability by copying the bird powers in the brown section there of other player birds. And one of my favorites, the tawny frogmouth, gives you additional food resources. It's such a prodigious hunter. One of the kind of interesting experiences during play is when you play the southern cassowary. Its presence in the ecology of the tableau, and we'll get into that in a sec, is so dominating that it forces other birds to leave, but it gains a clutch of eggs and bonus food resources. So I'm going to pass over all this. I was trying to fit everything in 15 minutes. I'm already 8 minutes in, so I'm just going to skip over all of the game study stuff and talk about ludo-thematic resonance a little bit more, just super quickly. So ludo-thematic resonance is about this relationship between what Altus calls the ludic contract and the thematic contract. So rather than talk about kind of narrative and story, which is very different in board games, and that's a whole other presentation. But it's the space that's created between the game mechanics as you play bird cards into. You can see there on the table that kind of square thing in front of you there is the tableau, and the thematic resonance that comes from kind of enjoying this experience. So the ludo-thematic resonance, and this is the official description of the bird, is this balance between wingspan, as in the top description, slightly, it's interesting it's called as a competitive because it's not really, but it's a medium weight, card-driven, engine-building board game that puts you in the position of the bird enthusiast, the researcher, the bird watcher, the ornithologist, and the collector, into which you are placing birds into an artificial space. It's an aviary, a reserve. It's not a real space at all. It's quite fictional and quite imaginative. And only birds exist in this space. Well, birds and food. No other predators, no other animals exist in this space. No humans exist in this space apart from you placing the birds into this. So it's very much not a simulation. A lot of board games and a lot of course, video games tend to try to simulate the world around it. This is very much not a simulation. It's an imagined. So I was originally writing about it as a utopia until I was introduced to this article about heterotopias and board games, and I thought, yeah, right, that's exactly what's going on here. It's this other type of space. So this heterotopic space of the Eurogame, as Wilson says, is an opportunity for us to open up realms of personal meaning. So as we start to play, and as we start to open up this folio, so this is what the board looks like. Each player has an individual board. You're not really interacting with each other. You're just playing birds into your aviary, into your tableau. And this is the Australia, or the Oceania, sorry, tableau. And that's the back there. And you can see as you start to play, you're playing birds into different types of habitats. So you have the bush habitat, you have, or the woodland or bush, you have the grassland or the scrub, and you have your waterways or wetlands. And as you're playing these birds, you're getting more and more powers, more and more options, more and more strategies, more and more abilities to do things. And you are trying to get points, but often the game is kind of, you kind of get lost in it sometimes, and you kind of just focus on what birds are attractive to you, or what birds are resonating with you, or what birds are doing. And so it became apparent to me as I was going through this analysis that this game and the theme is not about birds. It's not about birds. It's not about the being of birds. It's about the organization of human knowledge about birds. And I use this this kind of 5-dimensional analytical framework to think about this relationship. So the first dimension, of course, is planarity. The planarity enacts Foucault's second principle of heterotopias, which is the way in which spaces change according to the synchrony of culture. And so I was thinking about the way in which zoos have changed over time, from exhibition spaces to centers of conservation. And similarly, then that helped me think about how this space was a kind of contemporary fashion. And I think this resonates a little bit with what Sue was saying about, this is a way for people to engage with birds without the kind of crisis of the Anthropocene, or maybe in spite of it. It's a kind of total expunging of all of the problems associated with, habitat devastation and things like that. The planarity of the bird cards means that they are a canvas. They even have a canvas look and feel. So when you touch the cards, there's a really high materiality. And that's to do with the larger genre of games that Wingspan sits in. Wingspan is typically thought of as a Euro game. Euro games really came out of Germany in the 1990s and helped popularize the kind of niche hobby game. You're probably familiar with something like Settlers of Catan. That was kind of one of the leading texts in the Euro game. And the planarity of the cards is quite interesting. There's a really rich history, I'm going to skip over that, of planarity and information on cards, going back to when cards were often featured historical or moral or religious lessons in order to get past concerns about cards being used for vices and gambling and things like that. And this continues now. I'm going to skip over the anatomy of the card, although I do find this really interesting. Cards have ordinality, which means they can be divided into sets and classifications. And again, this is just another way that the game is expressing human knowledge. It's all about the Latin taxonomy. It has a kind of fun facts section down the bottom of the card. And all of the birds are classified into different habitats, different points, different nest values. And so this is very much in line with Foucault's third principle of the heterotopia, which is about juxtaposing the incompatibility of multiple sites within a real single place. He has this lovely discussion about the garden being the smallest parcel of the world that is then the totality of the world, and I talk about how the tableau of Wingspan achieves that. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to skip through thinking about the uniformity of the platform, which is about this high-grade materiality, the way in which the designer is twisting the assumptions of Eurogames by adding in dice mechanics and how that has an effect on how we think about the relationship to the birds. I'm going to skip over all of the artist stuff. That's my time. And I just really want to end with just, oh, there's the bird feeder. I love the bird feeder. I could talk for another half an hour about the bird feeder. I just want to skip over and just show you some of the wonderful things that the huge community of players of Wingspan that include, you know, bird enthusiasts and game enthusiasts have kind of overlapped, particularly in this huge Facebook group, and they create things for the bird game to explain. So someone's created a case, someone's created a dice tower that you throw the dice into. There's lots of people who have made kind of polymer clay birds, laser cut, acrylic food tokens, and this is one of the most splendid game expansions I've ever seen. They've actually created a dice tower into this stomp, and they have the game included there. So I'm sorry to rush through that. How do I stop sharing? There we go. So, but that's a kind of whirlwind tour of my thinking and what I'm trying to achieve in that chapter. So thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. So now Graham is going to give a brief response, about 5 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions from the rest of us.
All right, I'll just set my timer, since we have to keep to time. Chris, I very much enjoyed finding out your take on Wingspan, which is a game I've never played myself, but I had heard of before you told us about it today. I belong to a local bird club, and we had a presentation from a very enthusiastic player about the game. We were all encouraged to rush out and get ourselves copies and start playing. And that response was, I thought, interesting in that the person making that spiel to us was not somebody who was the kind of person you would think would be a keen games player. And it does appear from what you've been telling us that this particular game extends to a quite broad demographic in the way that some card games do, you know, games like Monopoly or stuff like that. So I wondered if at some point you could talk about the demographics of players. I don't know if you have any statistics or anything, but I'd be interested to know whether it appealed very broadly or to particular segments of the games market or to a completely new market. Yeah. Secondly, I was interested also in your use of heterotopias as a way of thinking about Wingspan. And I was thinking that heterotopia is really, I suppose, something you could say was characteristic of every game, insofar as you enter into the game, you're moving from the world of daily life, normality, ordinariness, into a game world. And I wondered whether in Wingspan, the heterotopia allowed players to behave differently, whether it was a space of freedom, whether you could gather your bird cards together in a way that you couldn't just go out and, you know, gather birds, whether it was the same kind of engagement that photographers get who go out collecting photographs of particularly of things that appeal to them and interest them. And on a slightly more downward note, I wondered whether engagement with this game gave you a space not to engage further outside the game with ecology and bird conservation, but a way of avoiding it, in the same way people might make claims about glorious, television, David Attenborough style documentaries, beautifully photographed, very warm and fuzzy, but do they actually act as a kind of substitute for engagement of a more lasting kind? So I'm thinking that would be interesting to hear your views on. And I was also struck by the fact that the point of the game seems to be to get as many points as you can get after 4 rounds. And I wondered how that fitted with a notion of competitiveness, whether that is in fact what drives players, or whether they're more interested by some of the other aspects of the game and the play experience that you spoke about, collecting particular cards that they like, enjoying the extra little things that they've created to help the game experience. So I also had thoughts about whether or how competition fits within this particular game space. And that, I think, is my 5 minutes, so I'll shut up.
Thanks, Graham. I'll answer the first and the third point because I think they're connected first. So Elizabeth Hargraves, and I talk about this in the chapter, deliberately set out to create a game that wasn't about castles and trains, which dominate that market. She wanted to create a game that about something that she cared for, and it was about bird. And she's a bird watcher, so she wanted to create that. But she's also a scientist, and I think that informs the way in which the game came together. The high materiality, the kind of niche element, meant, and the kind of lovely materials that go into this box meant it was extremely popular. And she really hit that kind of magical crossover point between bird enthusiasts and who might play a game, and game enthusiasts who might be interested in birds. And then the kind of peripheral market around that of people going, oh, that's quite a beautiful object. I wonder what that's about. And so it's really been a massive bestseller. And she gave a lecture to New York University last year where she talks about how this game has appealed to women. The board game industry has, historically, particularly because of its war game origins, has appealed to men. And she talks about constantly being approached on Facebook and on social media by people who say, I've never played games before. I've loved this game. This is awesome. What's your next game? And she's got a new game coming out about the life cycle of moths, which is quite interesting. So she really expanded dramatically the audience of board gamers through this, and it's now a really huge bestseller. So part of the appeal to women, I think, was the lack of head-to-head player competition. The competition in the game is about simply doing better than you did last time before, and that's typical of the Eurogame style. So the emphasis is on points, but I certainly don't play for points. I play for interesting synergies between birds. That's what drives me, and I think from what I've seen on the Facebook group, that also drives them as well. And it even comes with a little notepad where you can record your score and you can try and do better each turn, each time you play. Elizabeth Hargraves has a comment in an interview that she did for, it was actually the New York Times, where she was saying that a lot of male games players would say, "Thank you for making a game for my wife," or "Thank you for making a game for my girlfriend." And I think that's a clumsy way of saying, "Thank you for expanding my horizons." And for helping me, get other people to care about games, right? So it's a way of getting people to care about games as much as getting people to care about birds. So to take that second point about the heterotopia, I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a real danger in the idea, and I do talk about this in the chapter, is that this is a way about deferring not deferring the importance of conservation, because I think it's not working as a simulation. Like there are really big popular games. One of the biggest at the moment is called Terraforming Mars, right? And it's a really hardcore simulation of what it would be to terraform Mars. And so it tries to create the realities of what that would be like. Whereas Wingspan is really quite trying to push away the realities of what it would be like to create a giant aviary and put all these bird species inside it. It's this really kind of imagined utopic space, which is absolutely, as you say, a freedom from thinking about conservation. And it goes even quite darker. And I talk about this in the chapter as well, because you're actually trading bird cards for resources in the economic system. So you're not only objectifying the birds, you're then using them for trading and making them into commodities. And so you're trading away birds that you don't want for eggs on other birds or more resources to bring in the birds that you do want. And I talk in the chapter about, how this is reflecting the kind of, the illegal bird smuggling that continues today, that is still hugely problematic. A black cockatoo is worth about 30,000 US. So there's this really dark element actually running through this game. But it's only once you start looking at it and pushing at it that this starts to emerge. And I'm refusing to let that dampen my enjoyment for this game, because it is a really fun game. So I think I answered both those questions.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris. Other questions? Joshua.
Sorry, I couldn't remember how to unmute. Thank you, Chris, and thank you for the gameplay that we had last week on this board game. It is a really extraordinary thing. And I suppose I wanted to respond to something that Graham said about how people play the game and the point system. I didn't actually realize when we played the game that there were points involved. My gameplay was, oh, look, a superb lyrebird. And I think that there is actually some kind of joy in that it's about the joy of encountering. I mean, this may be my particular response to birds, which is the joy of encountering different kinds of birds. So I didn't think of the board space as being a sanctuary or a cage. I actually thought of myself as being a twitcher, and this was me discovering a new bird, and I was exploring it that kind of way. So my question for you, Chris, is in your encountering with social media, how have bird watchers in particular engaged with this? Do they think about it as being a bird, because bird watchers do that thing where they collect names of, I encountered this bird on this particular date. The bird diaries are really important. Logbooks are really important there. Do they think about it in that kind of way, or do they think about it in that sanctuary or zoo kind of way? Has there been discussion around that?
So the Facebook group for the game is huge. There's 40,000 people in the group, and the most frequent type of post is about the expression of delight of encountering birds in their everyday lives. And so it's like, oh, I saw the hornbill, and here's my photo of it. So I think it's actually expanded the realm of kind of bird watchers out of people who have come to this game. What's interesting is when you see the bird watchers take to this game, and they're extremely competitive, and they deep dive into the strategies. Like at the moment, there's a strategy that's being discussed in the Facebook group about how. So when we were playing with Joshua last week, his budgerigar had tucked. So you take a card and you put it under that card, and you get a big pile and you get points of that. Joshua's budgerigar had the most amazing amount of tucked bird cards I've ever seen. And I was almost tempted to put this on the Facebook group because this is big news, right? This is, tapping into the engine and finding out the secrets of this. So the responses are quite different, but they all seem to be shared in this kind of lovely space. Yeah.
I think that question of starting with the board game and then taking that out into the world might be a way of countering that sort of anxiety, or even that question of the thing that Graham raised about nature documentaries as being something which closes us off, that we have the simulation of nature, whereas this idea of, oh, I found that bird in the card and now I want to go out to the world and find that, might be an interesting thing to talk about, because that allows us to engage with, actually leave this simulated space and go into a real space.
That's awesome. Thank you, Joshua. I needed a conclusion.
Well, Graham gave it to us.
Thank you, Graham, as well.
I can't speak for all bird watchers, but the ones who gave the presentation that I saw gave the presentation about the US version of the birds. So the bird cards they were exposed to were birds they couldn't see at home, but they were very interested in finding out about those US birds anyway. So it's not just, as Joshua was suggesting, going out to see the birds. It's more than that. You can find out about particular birds in other countries. That seemed to appeal as much as anything did about the game.
Yes, there's a lot of hype for the African expansion that's coming out in July.
Okay, we might just have time for one more question. Nikki, did you have your hand up? Did you have your hand up, Nikki?
I did.
Yeah,
Sorry.
okay,
I was
great.
just looking.
Thanks.
I think mine follows on from this really interesting discussion. I loved your point, Chris, about the fact that this game is about human knowledge about birds and how that human knowledge is organized. So it's kind of putting that human knowledge on exhibition, if you like. And so perhaps one more positive potential of the game is that it allows us to see the hierarchies, what kind of knowledge is privileged. And even within the anatomy of the card, I remember when I was playing it, there were indigenous knowledge about birds, although I think that was sort of italicized and at the bottom or something. So there were all sorts of ways in which the game was inviting a certain hierarchy, but perhaps in the playing of the game, we have opportunities to resist that hierarchy. So it was just a comment, and thank you. It was lovely.
Thank you, Nikki. That's a great point. I will definitely add that, because that's one of the arguments that Wilson makes about the heterotopia, is that it invites you to make those kinds of resistances and to set your own personal meanings into that. It's beautiful. Thank you.
Great. Thanks everyone for that discussion, and thanks, Chris. Fascinating. Fascinating. Yeah, as someone who has no knowledge about any game of any sort, really. Very, very interesting kind of insight into that world.